For those of you who have been with Confused Matthew from the beginning, you're probably wondering why I'm making an epilogue to a review that I finished almost 5 years ago. Well, the reason is because I've had 5 years to think about this and to listen to what you guys have been saying to me. And while my opinion of the film hasn't changed that much, my attitude towards some of it definitely has. And I think there's just a bit more that needs to be said about a few things here. Let's begin with an important detail that I should have talked about more in the original review. There is a big difference between a writer cranking out shit because the franchise will sell no matter what they do, and a writer who is backed into a corner and has to make the best with what little they have. Big difference. Zemeckis and Gale were at a disadvantage going into this one. They had no idea that a sequel was even going to be made on the back of the first film, and so they wrote the ending as standalone in Back to the Future Part 1. The ending that they wrote, while working well for a standalone film, doesn't make for a very good opening to a sequel. There are just too many limitations going in. We see the DeLorean going into the future, so this now has to be a future story, which Zemeckis and Gale never wanted to do. We hear that something's wrong with Marty's kids, so now we have to convolute something out of that line, and Jennifer is in the car. What the fuck are we supposed to do with her? And in addition to coming up with answers to these questions that will somehow gel into an engaging plot, they now also have the problem of several cast members either being absent or being in no condition to work. And on top of that, you've got the studio telling you, a sequel is going to be made. You can either do it yourselves, or we'll bring someone in who had nothing to do with your baby, but is going to mangle it anyway. But one way or another, this is going to happen. I don't care if it was Orson Welles or Friedberg and Seltzer. Anyone, any writer, would have had a hard time under these circumstances, and the last thing that I as an audience member should do is expect perfection. Let's consider a hypothetical. Rob and Bob sit down and watch my Back to the Future Part 2 review in its entirety. Now, let's get really stupid and assume that they even agree with all the points that I brought up. By the time this is over, they would probably only have one question for me. Well, what did you want us to do? And as I've been thinking about that question over the years, I realized that I don't really have a good answer to that one. Did I want them to turn around, go back to 1985, drop Jennifer off, and say, never mind, we're going to go somewhere else? No. They had the idea of going to the 60s instead of 1955 at the end and seeing Lorraine as a flower power hippie. Would I have preferred that? Not really. The bottom line is that there just weren't very many good options for them or very many good roads for them to go down. Now, I'm not just saying that because I can't come up with a better idea than a person who made a bad movie, I should just accept crap. It is the job of the writer to figure all of this out. But if I can't come up with a solution to the problems that were already built into the project, maybe I should just cut them a little slack. If Rob and Bob had known that they were going to do a sequel, would they have ended the first Back to the Future the way they did? No. Would they have made the sequel that they did? No. Would they have made something better? Probably. I mean, they did have free reign with the story and setting in Back to the Future 3, and that one turned out very well. I guess what I'm saying is that I still think Back to the Future Part 2 was a bad sequel and a bad movie in general, but I understand why it was so. And while I can't forget, maybe I can see my way to forgiving on this one. Now, having said that, there are a few things within the story that they could have done a better job with. First and foremost being Biff. Basically, the easiest way to solve the Biff problem is to not have him in the movie at all. He served his purpose in the first film, which we'll go more into later, and there really isn't any reason to have him do anything else here. He's only in the movie because he was a beloved character from the first film that everybody wanted to see, but that doesn't always mean your story is going to be better with him in the film as opposed to him without. If the film could survive without George, it could certainly have survived without Biff. So, who do we replace Biff with? Well, here's my idea with what you could have done to have the exact same story without dragging Biff down with it. Marty and Doc go to 2015, and while they're there, they encounter a homeless guy who had a bunch of failed businesses. He discovers the DeLorean and the almanac, gives it to his past self, and everything is the same, except with a character that doesn't run the risk of being out of character as a result. His actions are consistent with what we know of his character and of his motivations. Hell, they could even have written in that he knew Lorraine in 1955 and wanted to marry her and so on. Sure, that would have been a little bit far-fetched and tacked on, but it would basically have been the same difference. Another thing that could have been fixed is just the heartlessness of this story. The film is, for all intents and purposes, just a hyper-adventure film with no real underlying substance. It's the exact inversion of what the first film was. No heart. It's just the drinking of a 2-liter soda when compared to the fine wine that was the first film. Now, I stand by everything I said about the limitations of the story, but even within those limitations, there is a way that they could have made room for heart. And what frustrates me the most is that they brushed against this topic once, but never ultimately developed it.
Look in this pocket with a magnifying glass.
The almanac. Son of a bitch stole my idea. He must have been listening when I... It's my fault. The whole thing is my fault. If I hadn't bought that damn book, none of this would have ever happened.
That one statement should have been way more central to the story. Doc has been talking from film 1 about the dangers of time travel, but Marty has never really taken those dangers into consideration. And why should he? I mean, everything worked out great for him as a result of his time travel experience. His family's great, he saved his best friend's life, all is well. But now because of this one little mistake, it's all a nightmare. His family is in shambles, his best friend is committed, and his father is dead. This would have been a golden opportunity to explore that guilt, to explore the bigger questions of changing past, present, and future events, and they could even have had Marty question whether or not the changing of his future for the better was even the right thing to do. There is substance to be found in this one line that is later discarded simply for more action. If that one issue had been hovering over Marty's head for the rest of the film, it may even have transformed the novelty act in the last half into something meaningful. Alas, it was not meant to be. Now, before I wrap up this epilogue, I want to go into a big issue that you've all been flooding my inbox about. This is actually the issue, more than anything else, that convinced me to do this epilogue in the first place. Have you ever had a moment where you had a point you wanted to make that turned out pretty good, but after thinking about it for a while, the point you were trying to make comes to the surface way better than you originally said? Well, that is exactly what happened to me over the problem I had with Biff in the second movie, and you guys are what made that happen. My thanks to you all. I've been thinking a lot about some of the points you guys have made on the Biff issue over the years, and most of them I can accept without actually agreeing with. You guys think Biff was completely in character through everything that he did, and I don't. Totally fine with me. But recently, someone sent in an email that made me rethink what my ultimate problem was in the first place. It focused my real core problem like a laser beam, and gave me a better understanding of what my own hang-ups about the film were in the first place. This comment came from a user named Angland, and dude, I can't thank you enough. Honestly. His point was this. Your Biff retreated to his natural state of coward theory is false. If it were true, wouldn't he have retreated into his natural state of cowardice after Marty tripped him up or after he crashed into the manure truck? The change in Biff actually has more to do with George than Biff. I sat there for a while after reading this short little comment going, You know, you are absolutely right. Marty was standing up to Biff all the time in the first film, but it was George's action that made the ultimate difference in the end. Now, obviously on some level I knew that, but the whole Biff thing in the second movie still bothered me based on this issue. So why? What was it exactly about what they did in the second movie that I felt derailed the first? I went to the Matthew Cave and pondered this for a few days, really digging deep into what my problem was. And then it hit me. Like a puzzle you put together that suddenly takes form, I knew what my ultimate problem was. And it's all thanks to viewers like you. You guys rock. The problem lies in one key point made by this viewer. The change in Biff actually has more to do with George than it does with Biff. Back to the Future was essentially about two main issues. The first is of a kid from the 80s experiencing life in the 50s, but more importantly realizing his parents were once kids too. This issue comes to perfect fruition with the scene of Marty and Lorraine in the car. The second issue revolves around George, a small man who never realized his full potential because his own fears and insecurities were holding him back. This story resolves so wonderfully because in the original history, George never had a chance to battle those demons. A random accident caused Lorraine to fall in love with her ideal rather than the person George actually was. And in the new history, this almost happens again. Marty had intended to stage George's bravery rather than to develop it naturally. But in the end, the person George always could have been comes through, and he triumphs over his demons. So what does this all have to do with Biff? Well, based on everything that has just been said, it seems that Biff's character has two different presences in the film. The literal, being who Biff is as a character, and the representative. And it seems to me that even more important than who Biff is as a character in the first movie is what Biff represents in the story. Biff, over and above being a great character, is also the physical embodiment of all of George's fears and shortcomings. And when the moment comes for him to grow as a character, he isn't just standing up to Biff. He is standing up to all of his demons that have been holding him back. Literally and figuratively, he conquers them. After the 1955 Biff has been thwarted, we don't see him again until we get back to 1985. And then the metaphor is complete. Because he was willing to fight for the girl he loves, because he was ready to stop running and become the man he always knew he could be, George had reduced all of his demons and insecurities to this. That's almost poetic and a truly fantastic ending. But here's the problem when you throw Part 2 into the mix. Follow my logic on this. In Back to the Future Part 2, we do see 1955 Biff after George has conquered him, and he's the same muscle-headed jerk that he always was, which completely breaks the flow of going from demon present to demon conquered to demon neutered. Biff then conquers Marty, grabs the book, and runs away. Marty chases and retrieves the book as Biff plans to run him over and murder him while laughing like a crazy psychopath with bloodlust, but ultimately loses the book. This is now where we last see 1955 Biff, and when we see 1985 Biff again, it's the same neutered man we saw in the first one. But this is no longer a thwarted personal demon. It is now simply a thwarted bad guy who didn't hatch his evil scheme. This is no longer George's personal triumph. It is now merely Marty's plot triumph. In the context of the trilogy, it will never again be the case that Biff is the way he is at the end of the film because George conquered his demons and became a better person because of it. It will now always be the case that Biff is the way he is because Marty nabbed the book. And that bothers me. So there in a nutshell is a fuller, more complete understanding of why Back to the Future Part 2 got under my skin in the first place. This film is still bad in my view, but again, I can forgive. And for whatever it's worth, if I had to choose a movie to watch out of all the movies I've reviewed as Confused Matthew, it would be this one. Best of the worst. Thank you all for giving me loads to think about over the years, and I look forward to even more.